Believe it or not, in this wood shack beside the railroad tracks in Richmond, Indiana, is where one of the great jazz recordings of the 1920s was made. Out of hundreds of recordings made by the Gennett Piano Company, Zulu's Ball had disappeared from sight. Gennett wanted to make records to sell in its stores and had invited all comers to their little studio.
And they were not too far from Chicago, so they could tap on to what was beginning to happen in the 1920s in Chicago, which was the birth of jazz, you know, and Prohibition, the whole thing that was going on at the early part of this century.
Gennett recorded whatever bands it could, often on a whim and always on the cheap.
Some great people turned up at that doorstep, like Jelly Roll Morton and the Dorsey brothers. Tommy and Jimmy Dorsey made some of their first records there.
And it was here that the rarest of all jazz records, King Oliver's Zulu's Ball, was recorded in October 1923. King Oliver, a New Orleans jazz musician, had brought his band to Chicago to play their distinctive brand of music. Journeying down to Gennett on the weekends, they recorded some of the greatest jazz classics of the era. Race records, they were called at the time, and the first important recordings made by black musicians.
The significance of the King Oliver Band, besides King Oliver, who's obviously, that's the name of it, but it was truly a band of New Orleans people. And even back in 1923, people knew that jazz came out of New Orleans.
Joe Lauro is a collector of the historic. In fact, his business is an archival film library in East Hampton, New York. But his real passion is classic jazz recordings from the 20s. And the holy grail of these recordings is Zulu's Ball. Not only because it made a direct connection with the foundation of early jazz, the music of Mardi Gras, but also because it was missing. Of all the early King Oliver recordings, this was the one nobody could find.
The record had its origin in Mardi Gras, and back in those days, Mardi Gras was segregated. So there was a black Mardi Gras and a white Mardi Gras. And the high point of the black Mardi Gras was the crowning of the king of the Zulus.
King Oliver recorded Zulu's Ball at Gennett on the same day they recorded several other of their hits. The youngest and newest member of the band was a trumpet player named Louis Armstrong. But for this recording, King Oliver had him play the second cornet.
The band was great because it had some of the greatest New Orleans players of all times in the band. Not only King Oliver, but Louis Armstrong was a phenomenon. We know him as this guy wiping his forehead and singing Hello, Dolly with amazing style, but what people don't realize is that in the 1920s and early 30s, this man was the top guy on trumpet.
King Oliver's Creole Band's recordings, featuring Louis Armstrong, are considered one of the cornerstones of early jazz. The Gennett studio eventually closed as the major labels took control of the business. But the music wasn't forgotten. In the decades that followed, dedicated collectors began to search for those early Gennett recordings.
These Gennett records were really the ones that everyone wanted to find. No one knew that much about them. There wasn't books written about this stuff. Collectors were making it up as they were finding the records and guessing who played on it. They were interviewing old musicians. So these Gennetts were really the cornerstone because it really is where it began in regards to black jazz recordings.
Anything with the Gennett label became highly collectible, and legions of jazz fans searched for the rare recordings. Jerry Wexler was one of those early collectors.
You would just see this label and your heart would leap. It pulsed the artwork by transference. Well, it had magic, because you knew that this possibly bespoke some great music. So this was the hope to find a treasure trove somewhere. But most of it was done with hard work in old furniture stores, junk shops, Salvation Army depots.
They didn't have garage sales back then, as we do now, but there were used stores. Furniture stores were great places to find records. Used furniture stores. Someone would die, and they'd have a cabinet or a Victrola, and there were records in these Victrolas. If there were some great records in there, the guy would say, well, you want the records, you gotta buy the phonograph. So if there were enough good records, you'd buy the whole damn thing.
But Zulu's Ball never showed up. The only thing anyone knew for sure was that it had been recorded. Even the master was missing.
I mean, you know, everyone wanted to find it, and it remained a mystery through the 1930s. Then, World War II. And what happened during World War II? There were scrap drives. Shellac was something of value to the war effort, and the government was sponsoring people to turn in old phonograph records.
One dedicated collector in Chicago positioned himself in one of the reception centers looking for any rare recordings that might appear.
And he was going through a pile, and sure enough, he finds this nice blue Gennett label. Oh, what is it? Zulu's ball. I mean, he probably nearly passed out. He knew that this thing was missing. Zulu's ball had finally been discovered.
Joe Lauro has tracked its progress, waiting for an opportunity to acquire it. And in the meantime, building up a large body of vintage newsreel footage from the jazz era. But his real passion is in this room, an enormous collection of classic jazz recordings. Lauro recently added another disc to the shelf dedicated to Gennett. What is recognized as the rarest jazz record in existence? This single solitary 78 recording of Zulu's Ball. Lauro jumped at the opportunity to purchase the record. It was part of a larger collection that he and a partner bought for over $200,000. Lauro believes that Zulu's Ball is worth about $30,000 if he was ever to sell it.
Any record collector is going to want to hear Zulu's Ball. We go to record shows, and the collectors gather around. They literally want to touch this record. I've seen tears in people's eyes because they're thinking about Armstrong, and they're thinking about the whole mystery of this thing and just what it represents to American jazz. It's just one of these moments where these great artists came together, and this is one bit of their legacy that really has been missing for so long and just exists in this one recording.